Hear about you deploy a new version of software, and then your event logs start filling up with bad news.
Yeah.
We're talking about that scenario. So yeah, I think it's definitely a signal you should be listening out for. And I remember my very first DevOps role was that I would sit next to the ops engineer when a deployment was happening, and we would have the event log open. That was
Yeah.
like the very first DevOps, because before that we weren't even there when they deployed.
Hmm.
And that was our main signal to see if something was going wrong. But I'm interested in why you would automate your response to that signal.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was a bit concerned about that because I I've I had kind of something similar when I first started automating deployments. We deploy, and then after we deploy, we'd look at the error logs and like, oh my gosh, we need look at all these errors coming through. But in my particular case, oftentimes it was just one person, and they're just hitting the same button over and over and over again, and it was just throwing errors left and right on something like that. And so you needed to have a bit more context into why the error is occurring, not that, oh my gosh, look, errors are happening, errors bad. And in fact, some errors are just caused by a configuration that you weren't expecting for one particular user or for a subset of users. And is that enough to say, I need to roll back to a previous version versus I need to contact that person or dive a little bit more into their configuration and kind of understand it. So just triggering something automatically, I think, is very dangerous because without the appropriate context, it's hard to know. And then you end up spending so much time on all of these different rules and all of these different processes to hopefully automate successfully.
It's interesting actually because you just reminded me of a situation I had where we deployed a new version, and obviously we had users around the world, so there were always people using our app.
Yeah.
And we deployed a new version, and we started getting errors. And it turned out that the errors were caused by people that had opened a form before we deployed. When they
Yeah.
tried to submit the form, we changed it, right? And
Yeah.
so it didn't work and we got errors. So if we had automatically rolled back in response to that, we would have then seen a second wave of people who opened the form after the deployment, who then tried to submit it after the rollback.
Yeah.
So like you can end up making a situation worse if the cause is something to do with the deployment, like something cached for a couple of minutes that is causing you a problem, or you've changed like if you've got like some kind of anti-forgery key that comes through, and when you deploy, you
Yeah.
somehow invalidated that. That just happens again if you then roll back.
Yeah. Yeah, the other thought that I had, yeah, exactly that. And then the other thought that I had was, I mean, if you look at what we do at Octopus Deploy, you define your deployment process once, and I'm going to reuse that across multiple environments. And so, let's say I'm deploying from my main branch, and I want to deploy to test my staging environment, then production. And we also really want to make sure that you deploy the same artifact that you built for test, staging, and production. I'm not rebuilding each time I go to a different environment. And so the question that I always have is, well, if you deploy the same artifact and you're using the same process, why weren't those problems found much earlier in the process? Why wasn't it found in tests? Like, why were these errors not discovered? Now, I understand that, yeah, you're going to run across use cases you weren't expecting. You're gonna run into certain situations where there's a configuration you weren't expecting, or like you said, the website browser was still open to the old version, and that happened to me as well, because people would leave their browsers open because I was working on an internal application. They just leave it open overnight, and it's like, oh man. But it happens. But my question is like, why wasn't so much of these problems caught much sooner? Like, if it's such a critical issue, how did it not appear in your testing environments? What's different between your testing environments and production? Why aren't you testing in a production-like environment? So it's almost like by having the concept of error budgets and automatically rolling back, what you're doing is you're shifting your quality gates to production, when in reality they should be shifted much sooner and finding these errors. And again, the when I say the concept of deploying a new version of code and releasing a new version, releasing new functionality, to me, and you might have a different experience, but every single new feature I had was really the cause of almost all my new critical errors. It wasn't I released a bug fix and I caused more bugs from that, or I released a performance fix and suddenly caused more problems. It was almost caused by a new feature or functionality, and that's when you should be using something like feature toggles to enable and disable that functionality. So I can roll out a new version of code with that toggle disabled, and then hey, it's probably not going to throw errors until I hit this toggle. And then but I
Right.
have a much more controlled way to do it because then I can progressively deliver to maybe a subset of users and verify, yep, I'm not seeing any sort of problems. People have been using it, everything along those lines.
Yeah,